A ship was struck, an evacuation order was issued, and somewhere in a situation room, a decision is being made that will shape the next decade of global order. The question is not whether you heard the news, the question is whether you understand what the news is actually telling you. Because there is the story they are showing you, and then there is the architecture behind the story, the framework of interests, pressures, and long-running strategies that produced this moment, and that second story is the one that actually matters. Here is the critical realization I want to plant right now, and I will fully unpack it in the final third of this conversation. What is unfolding in the Arabian Sea is not a regional flare-up. It is a carefully pressured response within a global recalibration of power, and the evacuation order that followed the strike is not a panic move. It is a choreographed escalation signal sent to three audiences simultaneously. Keep that in your mind as we walk through this together. Let us start with what we know. An Iranian-linked strike on a commercial vessel in the Gulf of Oman has triggered an evacuation order in the surrounding operational zone. If you are reading the mainstream coverage, you are being told this is another chapter in Iran's pattern of maritime aggression, a rogue state lashing out. Simple, clean, villain identified. But the moment you step back from that framing, the moment you ask who benefits from this particular escalation at this particular time, the picture changes entirely. Because geopolitics is not a story about good actors and bad actors, it is a story about interests, leverage, and timing, and the timing of what just happened in Oman is not accidental. To understand why this matters, we have to look at where Iran sits right now on the global chessboard. Iran has spent the better part of 4 decades under the most comprehensive sanctions architecture in modern history. Its banking system has been strangled, its oil exports have been throttled, its currency has been devastated, and yet Iran still exists as a functioning state with a military doctrine, regional proxy networks, and a seat at the table of the emerging multipolar order. That is not an accident, that is the result of strategic patience and a very deliberate alignment with the Russia-China axis that has been building quietly beneath the surface of Western media attention. When Iran strikes a vessel in Oman, it is not simply lashing out, it is communicating. The Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman are not incidental bodies of water. Roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf just west of Oman. Any disruption in that corridor sends an immediate tremor through global energy markets, through insurance rates, through the cost of everything that moves by sea. Iran knows this. Tehran has always known this. It is their single most powerful piece on the board, the ability to hold the global energy artery at credible risk. So when a strike happens and an evacuation order follows, you have to ask yourself the deeper question, what conversation is Iran trying to force? Because strikes like this are never purely kinetic events. They are diplomatic communications delivered through military hardware. And the message being sent right now is aimed simultaneously at Washington, at Riyadh, and at the capitals of Europe that have been trying to resurrect some version of the nuclear deal while maintaining their loyalty to American pressure. Iran is telling all three audiences, we are not cornered, we are not desperate, and we retain the capacity to make your world very expensive. But to understand why this particular moment was chosen, we have to look at what has been happening in the broader landscape of the Middle East over the last 18 months, because the regional architecture has been shifting in ways that are genuinely historic and that the Western press has largely failed to contextualize. The Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Gulf states, were sold to the American public as a peace framework, and on one level they were. But on another level, they were a strategic attempt to construct an anti-Iran coalition using economic normalization as the binding agent. The idea was to pull the Gulf states so deeply into an economic partnership with Israel, and by extension with the American security umbrella, that their interests would naturally align against Tehran. That project has been under severe stress. The Gaza conflict shattered the political viability of open Arab-Israeli normalization for a generation. Saudi Arabia, which was the ultimate prize in the normalization strategy, pulled back. And as Saudi Arabia pulled back, it also began hedging in the other direction, re-engaging with Iran through Chinese mediation, reopening embassies, restoring diplomatic contact. That Beijing-brokered Saudi-Iran rapprochement in early 2023 was one of the most significant geopolitical events of the decade, and it was treated as a minor news story in most American outlets. It should have been treated as a 5-alarm signal. What it signaled was that the Gulf states, the traditional anchors of American power projection in the Middle East, were no longer willing to be exclusively in the American camp. They were diversifying their geopolitical portfolio, and that diversification has continued. Saudi Arabia joined the BRICS framework. The UAE deepened its economic ties with China. Qatar continued to play its independent gas diplomacy. The entire Gulf Cooperation Council became, in strategic terms, a genuinely non-aligned zone, willing to do business with Washington but no longer bound to Washington's strategic agenda. This is the landscape into which the Oman strike lands. And you have to appreciate what Iran is reading when it looks at that landscape. It is reading opportunity, not opportunity for conquest. Iran's leadership is not suicidal. It is reading opportunity for leverage. Because in a Middle East where the American alliance structure is fracturing, where the Gulf states are hedging, where Europe is economically exhausted and politically divided, Iran's ability to credibly threaten the energy corridor is worth more diplomatically than it has been in decades. Now, I want you to sit with the question for a moment, and I genuinely want your thoughts on this in the comments. Do you believe that the United States currently has the political will, the economic capacity, and the domestic consensus to fight a full-scale war with Iran? Because I think that question is the axis around which everything else in this story rotates, and I think the honest answer, when you strip away the military briefings and the carrier group deployments and the tough talk from the podium, is far more complicated than Washington wants to admit. The American military is the most powerful conventional fighting force on Earth. That is not in dispute. But power projection is not the same as political will. The Iraq War cost over $2 trillion and produced a country that is now more aligned with Iran than with Washington. The Afghan campaign consumed 20 years and ended with a humiliating withdrawal that the entire world watched. The American public across the political spectrum has developed a deep and justified skepticism about open-ended military engagements in the Muslim world, and any administration that chose to escalate against Iran would be doing so knowing that the domestic political cost could be existential. Tehran reads American domestic politics as carefully as any think tank in Washington does. They watch the polling numbers, they watch the congressional debates, they watch the fatigue, and what they see is a United States that is militarily capable but politically constrained. A giant that can threaten but is increasingly reluctant to commit. That gap between capability and will is exactly the space that Iran is operating in when it authorizes a strike in Omani waters. To understand the full geometry of what is happening, we also have to talk about Israel, because Israel cannot be separated from this equation, no matter how much certain parties would prefer it. Israel is currently in the most complicated strategic position it has occupied since its founding. The Gaza campaign has consumed its military, divided its society, damaged its international standing in ways that will take a generation to repair, and stretched its intelligence and operational capacity to limits that were not anticipated. The Abraham Accords normalization track, which was supposed to provide Israel with a strategic depth and a Sunni Arab alliance against Iran, is, as I noted, on life support. And here is the brutal strategic reality. An Iran that feels confident enough to strike commercial shipping in Oman is an Iran that is explicitly testing whether Israel, in its current condition, can meaningfully respond. Not just whether America will respond, whether the entire architecture of deterrence that has restrained Iranian action is still functional. This is what I mean when I say that strikes like this are communications. Iran is probing the system. It is asking, where are the tripwires now? Because the tripwires of 2019 and the tripwires of today are not in the same places. Let me ask you another question that I think deserves serious reflection. When you look at the evacuation orders, the carrier movements, the emergency meetings at the Security Council, does it feel to you like a system that is in control, or does it feel like a system that is reacting? Because those two things produce very different outcomes. A system in control can de-escalate. A system that is purely reacting is susceptible to the kind of cascading miscalculation that has started every major war in modern history. I do not say that to be alarmist. I say it because pattern recognition is the most important analytical tool we have, and the pattern right now has a very uncomfortable resemblance to several historical sequences that ended very badly. Now let us talk about the economic dimension, because this is where the story connects to your life in a direct and material way. An escalation in the Gulf of Oman does not stay in the Gulf of Oman. The insurance market for maritime shipping through the Strait of Hormuz will reprice immediately. It already has in previous incidents. When shipping insurance reprices, freight rates go up. When freight rates go up, everything that is transported by sea, which is most of physical global trade, becomes more expensive. That inflation feeds into supply chains, into retail prices, into the cost of food, energy, and manufactured goods. The American consumer, who is already dealing with the residual inflation of the post-pandemic monetary expansion, does not need another supply-side shock, but that is precisely what a sustained escalation in Omani waters would deliver. There is a school of thought, and it is not a fringe school of thought, it is held by serious analysts in serious institutions, that some actors with interests in global commodity markets actively benefit from these escalation cycles. When oil prices spike on a Gulf incident, certain sovereign wealth funds, certain trading desks, certain energy producers outside the conflict zone capture enormous windfall revenues. The chessboard, in other words, has players who have a financial interest in the game continuing rather than concluding. Understanding who profits from the sustained existence of a crisis is always more illuminating than understanding who started it. This brings me to the role of China, which is the piece of this puzzle that most American analysis stubbornly refuses to integrate. China is Iran's largest oil customer. China is also the world's largest importer of energy, period. A full-scale war in the Gulf is, in the short term, catastrophic for Chinese energy security. But China also brokered the Saudi-Iran deal. China also has the deepest economic relationships across the entire Gulf region. China is, in a very real sense, the hidden power in the room when any Gulf crisis unfolds, because no resolution of a Gulf crisis is durable without Chinese acquiescence, and no escalation reaches its maximum intensity without Chinese reaction. What Beijing is doing right now, behind the diplomatic formalities, is watching to see whether the United States is willing to pay the full cost of a military confrontation with Iran. Because if Washington commits, China learns something critical about American capacity and resolve. If Washington pulls back, China learns something equally critical about the limits of American deterrence. Either outcome advances Beijing's strategic understanding. And that is why you should be deeply skeptical of any narrative that portrays China as a passive observer of what is happening in Oman. China is not passive. China is studying. Now, I want to come back to the critical realization I planted at the beginning, because we are at the point in this analysis where it can be fully unpacked. I told you that the evacuation order following the strike is a choreographed escalation signal sent to 3 audiences simultaneously. Let me name those audiences precisely. The first audience is the United States. The message is, the cost of maintaining your military primacy in this region is about to go up. Every carrier group deployment, every emergency diplomatic flight, every Security Council emergency session costs political capital, financial resources, and institutional bandwidth that America cannot sustainably maintain at its current rate of global overextension. Iran is not trying to defeat America militarily. It is trying to make American hegemony in the Gulf prohibitively expensive. That is a fundamentally different strategic objective, and it is one that does not require winning a single battle. The second audience is the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The message is, normalization with Israel and full alignment with Washington comes at a price you may not want to pay. Every time Tehran demonstrates that it can reach into Omani waters and strike a commercial vessel, it is reminding the Gulf monarchies that geography is permanent and that America's security guarantees are not. The Gulf states have to live next door to Iran forever. American security commitments are, as recent history has demonstrated, conditional and revocable. Iran is betting that this reality will continue to push the Gulf states toward hedging rather than full commitment to the American security architecture. The third audience is the emerging multipolar coalition, Russia, China, and the broader global South, and the message to them is, Iran is a credible and durable partner. It has not capitulated under 4 decades of maximum pressure. It has not been destroyed or destabilized. It retains the capacity to act strategically and to impose costs on the Western-led order. For a country that has been systematically excluded from the Western financial system, that demonstration of strategic durability is its primary currency in the multipolar alliance. So when you look at the evacuation order in Oman and you feel the urgency of a breaking news alert, I want you to recalibrate your perception. This is not chaos, this is communication. It is a calculated move in a very long game played by actors who think in decades, not news cycles. And the danger is not that it spirals into full war tomorrow, though that possibility cannot be dismissed. The deeper danger is that the West responds reflexively, rhetorically, and without a genuine strategic framework, and that the absence of a coherent Western response accelerates the erosion of the deterrence architecture that has, imperfectly but meaningfully, constrained full-scale conflict in the Gulf for 30 years. I will leave you with a final question, and I want you to think about it seriously. If the current trajectory continues, If Iran continues to probe, if the Gulf states continue to hedge, if China continues to deepen its presence, and if American political will continues to be constrained by domestic exhaustion, what does the Middle East look like in 10 years? Not in terms of who controls what territory, but in terms of whose rules govern the energy markets, whose security guarantees matter, and whose diplomatic framework sets the terms of conflict and resolution. Because the answer to that question is being written right now in the waters of Oman, in the language of maritime strikes and evacuation orders that most people will forget by next week. The ones who remember and who understand what they are reading will be the ones who are not surprised by what comes next.